I think we need to understand how important this moment is for workers' rights as Trump is and Doge are firing folks en masse. Like, what's the impact of this on all workers? It's not just confined to the federal workforce. Why?
Yeah, the biggest mistake people could make right now is to think this is just going to impact federal workers themselves. And you suggested that, and it's entirely correct. It's not just that they're going to come after all unions next, but it's that the federal services that right now are getting decimated impact all Americans. So do you want to retire? I heard you were just talking about Social Security. How will you get your Social Security if there are half the Social Security workers in the administration, which is what they're proposing at a minimum? Yep. Are you interested in having your kids go to school? Well, how are they going to have grants and how are they going to have scholarships if they decimate the Pell Grants Foundation and if they decimate the Department of Education? Do you eat food? Well, how are you going to have food that is not polluted by these mega corporations that are just looking to make a quick buck if there's no regulation on food? Do you breathe air? All of these things that are currently people take, you don't, yeah, well, you might be the exception, but most people do. And the reality is that so many things that we take for granted as like a baseline level of functioning society are going to get destroyed if Trump and Musk get away with what they're trying to do, which is essentially privatize everything.
And then on that level, like in terms of the workforce, like what does it mean to have these researchers and scientists being laid off and then they're all going to seek work in the private sector? Like how does the private sector get impacted by this? Because I'm seeing there's a lot of, companies that rely on grants or rely on funding from the government in part, and they're firing folks as well.
I mean, it's a really big and open question. The reality is the federal government in this country and in so many other countries has had to put money towards the type of sort of social provision research that not all companies think is immediately going to be profitable, because there's a lot of research that benefits a lot of people, but that isn't necessarily going to make a quick buck. And it's precisely those types of initiatives that aren't immediately monetizable, but that help people, that frankly, it's not clear the private sector will take up the slack. And so, I don't think anybody has an answer. And I don't think the government really cares at this point, and they're not really trying to figure out, somebody else can do it. They just, it's collateral damage. What do they care?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the stories I've been wanting to cover is, and we won't be able to get to it in full, but I believe a week ago, Trump unilaterally dismantled the TSA union, which is wild. I mean, Sarah Nelson of the Flight Attendants Union called it Patco on steroids, was her quote. And there was this idea, I don't know how you could have had this idea, but that Trump might have been somehow pro-worker. By the way, TSA union, they're suing the Trump administration for disbanding the union. Now you can't have your union. But, the idea, okay, Lori Chavez DeRemer, who's the Secretary of Labor, she at one point, didn't believe in right to work, or she believed in the PRO Act. I forgot what it was. She then has walked away from all of those stances. What do you say to the people that thought that Trump would be minimally pro-worker?
Yeah, I mean, they were lied to. So, what I would say to them is you've been lied to. And the real question now is whether you're going to adjust now that the reality is crystal clear. There's no ambiguity now about what this administration represents as far as working people. Just to give you one anecdote, I'm not sure if you saw this, but it was just leaked the other day who Trump is going to appoint as the head of the National Labor Relations Board, the general counsel. It's a dude named Crystal Carey, who's virtually like this unknown lawyer who worked for Morgan Lewis. Morgan Lewis is one of the major union busting companies whose major client is Amazon. Right. So you're literally bringing this sort of hack from the union busting world to head the agency that's supposed to regulate labor rights. So this is the wet dream of Jeff Bezos and every union buster. Gross. And it poses a real question, I think, to the Teamsters union in particular, which is trying to its credit, organize Amazon. Well, this administration is actively doing everything possible to make that impossible and to try to undermine that. And so you have a choice. You can choose to call a spade and say that this is an anti-worker administration, or you can continue to paint lipstick on the pig of a Trump administration that has been already shown to be brutally anti-worker, anti-union. And, it remains to be seen what choice these union leaders make.
I mean, it's like, everyone who's trying to soft pedal Trump will find some way to deliberately finger you and your industry or your line of work. You're just like, again, Sean O'Brien, his whole ass is hanging out right now. Like, you're going to be the head of an Amazon union buster is going to be, or a lawyer. Was it a lawyer for them? Is going to be the head of the
Yeah,
NLRB?
just a lawyer. Yeah, a lawyer from, sort of just a lawyer
Like,
hack, essentially. And I think
what
it's
does
actually a
Sean
woman,
O'Brien
Crystal,
think?
not a man. I think I got that wrong. But
What'd you
yeah,
say?
we don't even know who this person is. They just
Right.
got announced. It's literally just, and you look up, it's a person, a union busting lawyer from Morgan Lewis.
Yeah. But I want to, I do want to pivot to talk about your book. And, I think really discussing this moment in labor history and all these like, upsurges that we've seen in retail and service industries. And actually like think about how it maybe at the end we could think about how it could apply to this very moment that we're living in, and even maybe building toward what I think a lot of lefties sort of maybe who don't know how to build for a general strike but say the words general strike because it seems like the only thing that could possibly grind what is clearly an assault on all of us and all of our rights and all these federal agencies, grind that to a halt. But really let's talk about unions as they are configured, because you kind of, you have this healthy critique of them. How are unions in their current iteration sort of clunky, top down, and like not necessarily able to adapt to like workshops that kind of like take off in terms of unionizing efforts?
Yeah, the basic problem, frankly, is that most unions aren't trying to grow. Your average union is just sort of servicing its own membership. And so in that context of crisis in we live, political, economic, ecological, it's just most unions are keeping their heads down, hoping that somehow they survive. And so just that as a basic starting point is deadly. It's not going to work. And maybe it's sort of worked for the last few decades, but at this point, it's just totally out of step with the moment we're in. So the most important thing is that unions need to start getting ambitious about organizing, because at this point, the labor movement represents 6% of the private sector workforce, 10% of the total workforce. So the reality is just if you are representing a tiny minority of the workforce, you're not going to have the power necessary to push back against the government and to push back against the billionaire class. So most unions need to pivot towards growing, and they haven't been. And that is a misreading of the situation. It reflects an over-reliance on hoping the Democrats are going to come save us. And God knows that's not going to happen now. The Democrats aren't even pretending they're trying to save us at this point. So it is incumbent on the labor movement to sort of fulfill the role that it played in the 1930s, when, frankly, there was a similar moment in which we didn't know whether things were going to go in an authoritarian direction or in a New Deal direction. I think the labor movement can reassert itself as sort of the standard bearer of welfare and the public good and democracy. But for it to do that, it needs to rely much more on letting workers lead, giving resources to workers to fight back, and not just keeping its head down and not relying on small numbers of staff to kind of pick on small little battles. We need millions of workers organizing. And the only way to do that is you put workers in the driver's seat.
Yeah, and talk to me about that, because like you have, documented some of these successful, or on their way to be successful unionization efforts. Starbucks is obviously one of the ones that sticks out, but even is it the reporters, the journalist guild?
Yeah, the news guild.
The news guild, which I think is, as someone in news or has been in and out of it, professionally, and especially with online news media being such an unorganized, group of workers, is fascinating to me. So, like, how have workers themselves been showing the way on this?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a record-breaking number of, for at least for the current, modern history of workers joining unions over the last 3 years. We had over 100,000 last year, about the same the year before, just a little bit less. And a lot of these workers are getting first contracts, and so you mentioned the news guild. The news guild has gone up against these horrible, evil hedge fund companies that are buying up all of journalism, and they've won. And these have been really hard battles. We're talking about like strikes that have had to last over a year in some cases. These aren't easy fights, and nevertheless, they've won. And I would say that that's a bit of a proof of concept. And frankly, Starbucks is also a proof of concept. They've gone up against the sixth largest private employer, these workers. They've organized over 550 stores. They faced the worst union busting offensive since the 1930s. And nevertheless, they forced the company to the bargaining table. At this moment, as we speak, the company wants to settle and the workers are holding out for a better contract. But it's not, it's not true that somehow all of these big corporations are just ignoring the workers. They've really succeeded in showing their power. So I do think that this shows the way forward, and there's enough victories to say, yeah, this is a totally viable model. And it's frankly sort of infuriating that the rest of the labor movement hasn't invested in this type of organizing yet.
Yeah, and I think to your point about Democrats, like not just the labor movement, but Democrats broadly, you have been talking and writing about labor I'm sure before this, but I mean, I think do you have another book about the 2018 teacher strikes in a lot of red states, which were incredibly inspiring and not, top down driven, not, led by the unions necessarily. This has all happened without, Bernie Sanders can't even really be called kind of like a union leader, but this has all happened organically without like either the union funds coming down or a Democratic Party line coming down, or really, again, you've got the NLRB under Biden being a massive, a really important step, and you don't discount that in your book, but imagine what could be possible if resources were changed, or that we actually had leadership that really did take unionization and union power seriously. You know what I'm saying? And it didn't have to just be on these movements to kind of go it alone.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The labor movement is currently sitting on 38 billion in assets that it's not using that should be used for this type of ambitious organizing. And frankly, if the labor leadership was serious about defeating Trumpism, and frankly, if the Democratic Party was, they would understand that the single best way to do that would be to start massively increasing union density. If you had 1 million workers joining unions every year, you'd start to turn around the sort of percentage of workers that are in unions, and Trump would have lost. The margins are still such that unionized workers, because they have this sense of an experience of solidarity and basic level of political education and class consciousness, vote against the right much more than their equivalents. And so even if it's just on a purely pragmatic ground of how do you defend and defeat the far right.
Your boss. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, the far right, but then also just, so even if you think that the thing is just political, which I don't, but if that's your criteria, you just want to defeat MAGA, well, then support unions,
Yes.
This is how you would do it, let alone the question of how you would build democracy at work. Because the reality is, if you don't have a union, you're living in an authoritarian regime every single time you punch in, every single time you show up for work. And so the question of democracy is sort of inseparable, I think, from the political and the economic sphere.
I love that. I did want to ask you, because I love that you don't separate unionization and labor from mass movements that, catch on, whether it's Occupy Wall Street, which, was more squarely about the economy, but even Black Lives Matter or the anti-genocide protesters and Gaza, being these galvanizing sort of, lightning rods, linchpins of moments, especially for young radicals. So and you document how that can be funneled into unionization efforts and labor movement. So talk about that.
Yeah. The part of what I did for the book is I did a large scale survey. I reached out to every single union drive that went public in 2022. So over 2,000 drives, and got a lot of data. And one of the things I asked every, worker leader that led a union drive was, well, what, if anything, led you to move in this direction? And one of the really astounding things that I thought maybe might be the case, but I was surprised by the findings, was the extent to which seeing or participating in prior social movements played a crucial role for so many of these leaders. And the number one factor was Black Lives Matter. So many of these workers had participated in Black Lives Matter protests. And then number two, very close after that, was Bernie Sanders. And then third was sort of LGBTQ queer issues. So the combination of these three movements really radicalized a lot of young people. So you're talking specifically about a Gen Z, a Zoomer radicalization in the context of these movements that introduced people, I think, to a radical critique of society. And then frankly, also the limitations maybe of these movements in their more mainstream varieties, or, seeing Bernie wasn't able to take over the Democrats, seeing Black Lives Matter not be able to sustain itself, led a lot of these workers to figure out how do we fight for liberation? How do we fight for political power? And the conclusion they come to is you need the labor movement. You need a stronger labor movement to do that, because unions have leverage. Because if you shut down your work, the boss has to listen to you, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. That's just a huge amount of power. And then frankly, it's a question of also, how do you persuade people? The workplace is the one place in our society where you're obliged to talk with a lot of people who don't already agree with you. So there's something about the labor movement, both because of its disruptive power and because it forces a level of persuasion on the left. We're not just doing echo chamber. That has a huge amount of potential power. And a lot of people came to that conclusion. And that's essentially why we're seeing this labor upsurge that we're seeing in this moment.
I think that your book really cuts across that lie that it is either, organizing along, class and in shops and unions and or, mass movements around things like racial justice, because you kind of track how they can be this like symbiotic relationship. And I think that's really important as we move forward in under this, again, dirty war fascism that we're living in right now. And so I love that you're like, actually, the Black Lives Matter movement contributed to people becoming more conscious about their, roles as worker and workplace democracy and all that. And I think that's really critical. I mean, I love also you talking about Starbucks and yes, specifically LGBTQ issues. Explain how that, I mean, for lack of a better term, identity politics fed into that union drive, and then maybe also add the Gaza element to it.
Right. And there's a lot of different identity politics. Corporate leadership had their own identity politics that was, profit making and shallow. But from below, the identity politics of the workers at Starbucks was crucial. So Starbucks workers were primed for unionization in part because so many of them were queer, and like Starbucks, frankly, particularly outside the big cities, is one of the few places that you can sort of be out at work. And so it had this attraction factor of a certain young queer worker that meant that when those expectations that the company would be something more humane and better were breached, right? People actually really did believe that Starbucks was like a humane company. And when people saw the reality that it wasn't, it was a very explosive dynamic. So you have that, you have the queer sort of culture feeding into unionization, and you had strikes over, the ability to put up pride signals and, and paraphernalia at work in a way that the management started backtracking on, because all of a sudden this stuff is no longer as, a lot of these companies that were very, very pro equality a couple of years ago are starting to backtrack already, right? So there's a conflict there. But then on Gaza, we saw a similar thing where, it was a very unexpected turn of events, but the members of Starbucks Workers United felt so strongly after October 7th about standing in solidarity with, with Gaza and with Palestine, that they demanded that their union issue a statement, and that, in solidarity, and that set this long kind of convoluted chain of events that ended up leading to a fight of the company. The company responded by saying that the union was pro-Hamas and pro-terror, blah, 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 all this crazy stuff. And out of this conflict emerged a boycott of Starbucks nationally and internationally that cost him $13 billion. It went viral online. And that was actually one of the major factors we found out in the book, through interviews and then just, looking at, some of the backroom data from management that ended up leading them to start bargaining with the union. They lost so much money from this boycott over Gaza that they felt like, this was one of the contributing factors that meant that they had to sort of start settling with the union. So you can see how these issues that might not immediately seem directly workplace related can feed into a unionization effort when the union is being strategic.
Yes, I love that. And also the way that like boycotts can be pro-worker. Like you can be sort of, leveraging as a consumer on the outside, working, in support of the unionizing workers and their negotiation efforts. I mean, which I know are ongoing and myriad and all that. So like, I love that. I guess I'm because my experience, I mean, it feels like your critique of, organized labor is a little bit like of my critiques around like the nonprofit industrial complex, right? It is, kind of professionalized revolution, except it doesn't do revolution. And the labor movement has never been a safe thing, especially not in this country where May Day was founded, right? What came out of like, this is a country with incredibly militant labor history and, and again, in all kinds of history, civil rights movements and all this. And so the idea that, of course, we need infrastructure. Of course, you need infrastructure. You need funding. I don't pretend, I'm not 18 anymore, but the ways that nonprofits have often, and also because of their funding, how they have to play it safe, have, limited some of the more radical thinking or radical approaches to a campaign, right? Lest they risk their funding. It seems like you kind of are leveling that critique at unions and all that. I guess I'm wondering, like, do they need to be remade? Like, I'm thinking of Nina Turner has a sort of a cross union effort that I think is We Are Somebody. I believe that's what it's called. But like basically funds that can be like pooled strike funds, things like this that are much less wedded to a particular industry or a particular union, or is it just like redistributing kind of the funds that already exist in the unions and having them available for like discretionary or to see upstart, union drives, or what's your solution?
I mean, I do think the ideal situation is that we're able to transform the existing unions to adopt the type of organizing we've seen at Starbucks and in the News Guild, where you're able to leverage the existing infrastructure and resources of the unions, but to put workers in the driver's seat. And so in the book, I talk in detail about what this looks like, where workers are able to set strategy and workers are able to initiate campaigns. And so I do think there's a best of both worlds scenario where you don't have to scrap the entirety of the existing infrastructure. And I think that would be a mistake, but in which you can leverage these resources in a way that really is facilitating genuinely democratic grassroots organizing. And that's going to require more risk. And as you mentioned, part of the problem when you're so professionally sort of staff driven is you don't take the risks that are necessary to win big. And it is risky. There's no guarantee that when you go up against a Starbucks or an Amazon or any of these companies or a Trump administration right now, if you're a federal worker, that you're going to win. But it is guaranteed that if you don't fight and if you don't try to take those risks, you will continue to lose. And so the only sort of force that's capable of driving forward a risky, ambitious dynamic really are workers. And so you need to have union leaders and kick out the battle union leaders. You need union leaders from below who will keep on fighting to move in that direction. So I think that Starbucks Workers United, News Guild, they show that there's some sort of synthesis possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I was curious about this. I think I listened to your interview on the Dig, and you talked about I believe it's DSA that is starting to encourage members and others to go back to salting or do more salting. Can you explain what salting is and why it's coming back around as a tactic, and what folks are doing now?
Yeah, so salting is when you get a job at a workplace with the goal ahead of time of unionizing it. And so salting played a really important role in Starbucks and initiating the campaign at Amazon. And sort of historically, this has been a crucial tactic of the labor movement, particularly for young people, particularly for young lefties who are trying to change the world. There's no better thing to do right now than to get a job to fight Bezos directly, to fight these evil billionaires directly. And at this point, the political fight is almost indistinguishable from the economic fight because all the billionaires are behind the Trump administration. So if you want to fight Trumpism, the best place to do that is in these big union battles. So DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, has launched a new SALT program called Workers Organizing Workers. And anybody listening to this can sign up for that. You just go to bit.ly, so bit.ly/salt now, so bit.ly/salt now, and you can sign up. And I'll give one more plug as far as organizing, because I would say that in addition to salting, the one most urgent thing that everybody can do is to support the federal workers who are fighting back. So we haven't talked as much about it, but I just really want to iterate that at this point, like the urgency of having the federal workers defeat, and I think they can defeat Elon Musk, is so central that no matter whether you're SALT or not, or if you're just a community supporter, going out there to support the workers who are fighting to save these services is crucial over the coming weeks, not like in 6-7 months, but like over the next couple days.
No, I mean, this is these are the backbone workers of our very country, right? It's like if we can't defend them, I mean, and this is what was really upsetting. And I don't know, Eric, maybe you have more of insight, but when all of this started happening, it's not like we didn't know it was going to happen because of Project 2025. And Democrats messaged around this. They knew. And so my question is, like, were the unions prepped for it? Did they have a response? Because it seems like a lot of federal workers are like, I don't know what to do. Do I take the buyout? Do I leave? Do I, what side are the police going to be on? Like, I mean, and that's, again, Elon's taken over, the U.S. Peace Institute with cops at his back. I mean, there was no, like, I'm like, what about interfacing with the police unions, which I know we all hate, but like, it's just a question of like, everyone's been very flat-footed, despite, again, the meme of guy with knife a million miles away. This shit is coming down the pike.
Yeah, the short version is unions were not prepared. And honestly, a lot of union leaders are still kind of taking their lead from the Schumers of the world, and that's terrifying. The good news is, though, that despite that, there's been a whole layer and a whole growth, frankly, of a federal workers movement in a way that was really unexpected. And, we've seen it somewhat like the 2018 teacher strikes, where, if the official leaders won't lead, the ranks will. And that is happening right now. So there's a new federal unionist network had big day of action just last week or the week before, and is scaling up actions all over the country. So if people who are, out there want to support, you can just go to savepublicservices.com to find out where the local actions are nearby you. And I'm actually really encouraged by this. And I think that what we've seen is that when, even if the top leaderships of unions aren't immediately fighting, a lot of times they will, under pressure, end up following the lead of their ranks. And so you're seeing that, and it's really amazing. It's a really heroic struggle, because imagine if you're a federal worker right now and Elon Musk is looking for any excuse to fire you. It's not a minor risk that when you speak out publicly, go to a demonstration, speak to the media. These are really heroic actions being done. Yes. And I think it's sort of incumbent on the rest of progressives and the left to kind of step up in the same way these federal workers are, because all of the doom and gloom that is very pervasive is a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, nothing can be done, everything sucks, Trump is just, everything's awful. Well, obviously things are awful, like today in Gaza, I'm heartbroken. But the reality is that these attacks are very unpopular. Musk is very unpopular. Backlash can take them down. And so now is the time for action. It's not the time just to like wallow in pity and misery. It's the time to like fight back. And I think if large numbers of people do that, Musk will be thrown overboard by Trump. Trump doesn't have, I think, enough of a commitment to Musk to like keep him in there, even if it takes the whole administration. So it's a winnable struggle, but it's going to require millions of people on the streets, not just hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, 100%. And I love that. And I save our services.com.
Savepublicservices.com.
Savepublicservices.com. Sign up and for actions in your area. And I think that's a really great way to get involved. And I totally agree with you. I mean, my cynicism tells me is like, well, Elon's just like Trump and Trump. No. Elon needs to go. Like, Elon's problem number one, and there's many others. But like, if we can get this little see you next Tuesday out of power, that would be massive. It's to say nothing of all of our private data. I mean, we just did a story that puts, it's like, who knows who he's giving people's information to, invading the Social Security Administration, stealing people's data and telling their banks that they've died. You know what I mean? Like, again, that's not proven, but it sure looks like what happened. Eric Blanc, thank you so much for joining me. Again, the book is We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. But also, you can subscribe to laborpolitics.com. And just, everyone needs to get on Substack. I am like not the person to say this because I was late as hell to this, but like laborpolitics.com. And anything else you want to plug, Eric?
No, I think that's it. I just, get involved, support the federal workers. One more thing I will plug. Yes. If you are a worker in a non-union workplace and you have not yet started organizing your coworkers, now is the time. And there's a really good resource for you to start doing that. It's called the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, EWOC, which I'm involved with, and it's been really effective in fighting back. So what you can do is you just go to workerorganizing.org and fill out a form, and a very experienced volunteer will help coach you through the steps necessary to start organizing your coworkers. So no matter what your issue is, whether it's Gaza, climate, racial justice, economic, just whether you just need to just get by, pay rent, the best way to impact that is building a union network, and EWOC is a really good step for getting you involved. So that's workerorganizing.org.
I love that. And I also think that a lot of people are like, they are partially employed, and I think that that's another thing that prevents people from joining unions. But so I don't know, you have thoughts on that in terms of people who are like, well, I have like 3 jobs,
Yeah, but that's the norm. Any job can be a union job. The reality is that a union is workers coming together to make demands on their boss. in building solidarity with each other. And so there's no law that prevents you from doing that. There's no structure that prevents you. One of the interesting things I found in my book is all of these really types of workplaces that you wouldn't expect there to be a union. People are building unions, whether it's a remote work or very sort of flexible, whatever, people have still found a way to build that power. So don't assume that unions are just for like coal miners or just for teachers or whatever you might assume it is. A union can be essentially anywhere for any worker. It's just up to you to make it happen.
And also, I do feel like the movements you've tracked are like changing the, image of who is a union worker and who's it unionized. Like, yeah, who's building the union and who labor is. It's like, let's stop buying into MAGA's definition of the working class and realize it is young radicals. It's people of color. It's women, it is queer folks who are leading these efforts. And again, to your coal miner point, we have to also stop buying into the myths that the right just hands us and lies to us about.
Right. I mean, and it benefits them. The right wing has a huge amount to benefit from pitting working people against each other, whether you went to college or not, whatever your like identity is. And it's crazy to me that the left buys into this sometimes too. And there's a sort of fetishization of certain types of workers. The reality is the workers are the vast majority of this country. We have so much more in common with each other than with this tiny minority up top. And I think that spirit of unity and that spirit of solidarity is just so much more powerful than all of the sort of weird silos that we like to draw between who's a real worker or not. And I think that it's time to move beyond that. And frankly, it's just, we don't have the time. At this point, there's a authoritarian coup going on right now. It's all hands on deck. It's everybody against the billionaires. And I think that's the spirit.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.